October of 1856. 5 overseers were discovered with sickles killed. No trials, no suspects, and no willing survivors. What took place on that plantation in Alabama? Did something much older emerge from the ground, or was it a revolt? Why? Do residents still stay away from the area where Hollow Creek used to be? And why is the soil there still unwilling to forget over a century later? It was justice, according to some. The harvest, according to others, never ceased. If you wish to adhere to authentic, to ensure you don't miss any of our investigations, subscribe to the channel right now and enable notifications. We tell stories that defy time and uncover hidden realities. It was 1856, nestled among the churning banks of the Chattahoochee River in the deep southeast of Alabama was Hollow Creek Plantation, a large expanse of lush land encircled by cypress woods, pale fogs, and the steady hiss of cicadas. Almost 200 enslaved men, women, and children ran one of the state's most lucrative cotton estates. The main house looked out over miles of cotton and was 2 floors high with green shutters and faded white brick, fields, and the huts of the laborers that lived there. However, the history of Hollow Creek would not be recorded in production records or ledgers. Generations would mutter in private that it was a location where something horrible had once woken up. The strange gaps in the estate's paperwork have long been recognized by historians. Hollow Creek vanishes from plantation letters, municipal tax records, and agricultural logs between October and December of 1856. Its name is accompanied by a single notation in red ink in the Barber County archives. Operation halted. The incident is being reviewed. Few people risked to document the specifics of that happened. However, for years afterward, both free and enslaved former local inhabitants recounted bits and pieces of a story that was too horrifying to be legend and too unfinished to be fact. They described a harvest season that started off like any other, with the scent of dust and cotton sap in the air and carts creaking across dry earth. However, the workers had become more silent by the middle of October. The majority of reports are secondhand and are only kept in lost diaries or family letters. Pages talk about restless nights, discomfort in the quarters, and odd chanting that, like a lament, is carried on the wind at twilight. The more superstitious employees were punished by the overseers who rejected these allegations, but the rumors persisted. Enoch Merritt, the chief supervisor, was notorious for his accuracy and brutality. That year, he imposed new quotas and penalties that were severe even by the cruel standards of the South. A number of enslaved laborers had vanished while he was in charge due to minor violations. Josiah, one of them, had apparently been imprisoned for 3 days in a dry well as retribution for staring at a white man. No one ever saw him again. The first scream shattered the suffocating atmosphere of dust, blood, and terror. Just after midnight on the evening of October 12th, witnesses subsequently stated that it originated from the eastern field. Then came one after the other. No one outside the plantation would yet be aware that 5 overseers would be dead before sunrise, each mangled with a sickle, their remains discovered strewn in the ruts between the cotton plants. Officially, no. The living family members and employees did not provide statements. Travelers were prohibited from entering the plantation, and for weeks, bribes and quiet held the local authorities at bay. The main house was unoccupied, the fields were left fallow, and the quarters were abandoned when investigators finally made it to Hollow Creek. The only signs of what had transpired there, something no one wanted to recall, were a few blood-stained tools and charred earth. Nevertheless, the land recalled. At Hollow Creek Plantation, October 12, 1856, started off like any other day, with the horn's blast resonating over the fields before beckoning the slaves to work at morning. The cotton was at its peak, pure, white tufts bursting from its bolls beneath a pale to oppressive sky. Overseers screamed directions, cracking their whips in the muggy air. The harvest was urgent, the deadlines rigorous. Every hand had to contribute, no exceptions. But that day, something was different. Enoch Merritt, the head overseer, observed the workers' eyes. They averted their eyes more than usual, not out of fear, but more out of contempt. A tiny but distinct pulse of resolution ran through them. Their motions were heavy yet effective, as if they were carrying out a plan they were not talking about. The customary muttering of song and prayer had completely stopped. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on dry earth and the rustle of cloth. There was no humming or crying. An uneasy silence descended upon the plantation by sundown. As the final bales were dragged toward the storage barn, the sky was scarlet with twilight. Then the true night started when the sun disappeared behind the trees. What occurred in the hours that followed was never formally documented. 2 surviving diary entries and second-hand stories provide the majority of what is known. One was from Sarah Alcott, a young relative of the plantation owner who had been visiting from Georgia, and the other was from a traveling preacher who had stopped close by. Sometime around midnight, the preacher reported hearing cries, not angry outbursts or inebriated arguments, something primordial, but recognizable enough. He described the sound as rising and falling like a chorus of misery, as though the earth itself was weeping. "I was awoken by firelight through the window," Sarah Alcott wrote in her entry from October 13, 1856, "and then I saw Enoch running. He stumbled. Something followed him. I could not make it out, but it gleamed." The following morning, when the fire was put out, 5 bodies were found throughout the plantation. All overseers, none of whom had died quickly. Enoch Merritt's body was found near the cane press. His wrists and throat slit with the murder weapon was a sickle of the type used in the cotton field. 2 others, Warren and Tilson, were found partially buried in shallow trenches, their faces hidden by harvested cotton. The 4th, Benjamin Rhee, was hanging by his ankles in the smokehouse, his eyes removed. And the 5th, Daniel Cobb, was the only one still holding a weapon, his chest opened, ribs splayed like a cracked fruit, having attempted self-defense. Each scene bore the same uncanny signature. Elias Holay, the plantation owner, was not present during the massacre because he had been traveling in a mobile. When he returned, he refused to speak to the local officials or the press. One was even left embedded in a support beam near the barn door, smeared with blood, as if placed there purposefully. No enslaved workers were found. Their quarters were abandoned. Beds were empty and belongings left behind, as though they had fled or vanished. "Caleb, you got us. The reapers were harvested by them. That night's events were not merely a revolt. They were precise, well-planned, symbolic, and followed by silence." In the days after the massacre, Hollow Creek was reduced to a blank space on the map, mentioned in whispers, shunned by tourists, and left off of the regular routes of patrol and trade. However, in a state founded on law and order, silence could not last forever. And a week later, the Barber County militia showed up. 30 men, grim and armed, were. The plantation had deteriorated at an unnatural rate. The fields, which had once been rigidly aligned, looked disturbed, the soil turned over in large swaths, as if something had clawed its way through the earth. The barn was little more than blackened timber and ash, and the overseer's remains had already started to rot beneath it. They had been sent not to investigate, but to contain. They had been sent to restore control, not to uncover truth. Swarms of flies, and the house, despite being unaffected by fire, smoke, and iron. The nearly 200-person enslaved population was gone, except for 14. They were apprehended close to the river's edge, hiding in a ravine. They did not fight or speak, and when questioned, they looked past their interrogators with a strange calm, a silence of completion rather than fear. The militia, taking their silence as defiance, rendered a swift and cruel verdict without trial. The cause is listed in official records as an agricultural terror event, a sterile and ridiculous phrase that appears in exactly one document, a Report submitted to the governor's office and immediately sealed, but artifacts started to emerge. In 1892, a local pastor studying family genealogies found a bundle of scorched pages hidden beneath the floorboards of an abandoned church in G, the area where they were executed by hanging from the cypress trees that bordered the property. Their names were never recorded, no clergy attended, and no graves were dug. Eufaula. The fading and broken text seemed to be from a journal that was thought to have been written by Elias's daughter Anna Holay. They sang in the fields again, but not the old songs, one page says. These were purely rhythmic and lacked language. Like thunder underneath, I felt it in my bones. Enoch was told to stop them by father. Josiah was stolen that night. Once more, the barn door's symbols have returned, deeply etched. This is where I drew them. They're not letters. They are not our property. Her drawings were accompanied with curved sigils that resembled vines or veins and were unidentified by any alphabet. However, the last entry attracted the greatest attention. Dated 2 days before to the incident, on October 10th, Ex sanguine libertas, which translates to from blood, freedom, was the only Latin phrase that appeared repeatedly. The origin and significance of these terms have been disputed by esoteric historians and contemporary academics. The implication is apparent, while some interpret them as metaphor and others as invocation. It's possible that the uprising wasn't spontaneous. It might have been a custom. Even stranger, a group of state archaeologists discovered a number of shallow holes beneath the original quarters in 1968 when studying the region for a planned industrial project. Inside were rusty but undamaged tools, including sickles, hammers, and knives organized in geometric formations, pieces of carved bone beneath one. The project was abandoned by the archaeologists. There was no formal report published. Even now, the area where Hollow Creek formerly stood as an unspoiled wilderness with suffocating vines and dense foliage, locals claim that the plow is rejected by the soil. Before they ripen, crops rot, and the air still has a slight iron odor at night beneath the moss-covered tree canopy. Time passed. The Civil War came and passed, and the slave economy in the South collapsed along with it. Men like Elias Holay and Enoch Merritt were relegated to footnotes in legal records and faded ledgers, and their names eventually disappeared from history books. Hollow Creek was eventually engulfed by the forest after being sold and abandoned. The cotton fields turned into thickets. Sometime in the 1880s, the main house collapsed in a storm, and the quarters sank into ruin. However, the recollection of what actually occurred there on the evening of October 12, 1856, persisted. Instead, it moved into the mouths of people who didn't have access to written language. Slave descendants, dispersed throughout Georgia and Alabama, brought a tale with them, one that was not recounted as history, but rather as caution. It was referred to be the night the earth woke. During the Federal Writers Project's 1930s, interviews, a number of elderly African-Americans cited a story that had been told to them by their grandmothers. One man, Isaac Toiver, who was in his 80s at the time, recalled, "My grandmama used to say there was a place where the cotton bled. Folks went quiet in them fields. They say the soil heard the cries, and one night it answered." These stories all had ghostly chanting in forgotten tongues, sickles moving through the dark by will rather than by human hands, and visions of ancestors rising from the soil. Some mentioned a circle carved into the ground, while others talked about the hidden drums. Not many provided names. Not a single one dared mention Hollow Creek. Folklorists started systematically gathering these stories around the middle of the 19th century. What they discovered was difficult to classify. Although the testimonials varied in detail, they were all consistent in structure. Some said the overseers were swept away by fire, some by shadows, and one by insects flying out of his mouth. However, the topic remained constant: a reaping, not chaos, but retribution. In 1974, an Auburn University anthropology professor, the location thought to be Hollow Creek, was visited by Dr. Lyle Winston. He brought cautious hope, ground, penetrating radar, and a tiny staff. They discovered underground abnormalities, cavities, and deposits that were incompatible with natural sediment in the clearing where the main house had formerly stood, which confused his argument. Layers of burnt wood, shattered ceramics, and, in one place, a human tooth embedded in a blackened sickle blade were discovered during excavation. Interestingly, the tool was discovered sitting in what seemed to be a purposeful configuration, with 5 stones encircling the point facing true, north, creating a pentagon. Dr. Winston's findings were cautiously worded in his publication, Geospiritual Residue in Southern Folk Sites. He proposed that the location might have been utilized for cultural expression or ritualized grieving. Nevertheless, he acknowledged his discomfort in confidential letters to co-workers that were ultimately made public. What was buried there was not discovered by us. We discovered what was sealed off. The neighborhood has seen a surge in paranormal enthusiasts and amateur ghost hunters in recent years. Most come back with hazy photos and tales of broken equipment. Some make more claims. One man, a podcaster from Birmingham, told how he heard what he described as moist footsteps behind him while strolling the grounds by himself at dusk. There was nobody there when he turned. However, he later saw 5 parallel cuts that appeared to be made by blades or claws running down his bag. However, the issue still stands. Who was the leader of this uprising? Who taught them the rites? If it was a ritual? There are simply symbols, murmurs, and wounds in the ground. No names or manifestos. However, there are instances when silence speaks for itself. Only a swath of untamed terrain is left of Hollow Creek Plantation today, and even the most courageous residents avoid going for a nighttime stroll. The land, which is now just identified in county records as Parcel 17A, is covered with black moss, tangled bushes, and immature saplings. Hunters stay away from it. Surveyors give it up. Additionally, those attempting to claim it for development, a peculiar series of failures is reported by land speculators, farmers, and loggers. Equipment malfunctions, engines stall, tools disappear. Locally born livestock frequently arrive motionless and deformed. However, the story endures even after being erased from memory and maps. The faint scorched traces that emerge every autumn around the center of the lot, the symbols carved into the bark of trees, and the testimonies of those who venture too close and return altered are not found in textbooks. A group of Auburn University environmental scientists sampled the soil throughout Barber in 2003. County to look into agricultural legacy contaminants from the 19th century. Results from Hollow Creek, which was only known as Sample Site 17A at the time, were unusual. Unusual amounts of decomposed organic materials were found in the soil, which was incongruous with plant breakdown. Off the record, one technician characterized the results as organic saturation, which is more common in mass graves than cotton fields. It was suggested that they cease testing. A year later, a storm uprooted a number of the property's old trees, revealing something that had been hidden beneath the roots for a long time. Iron remnants, a set of concentric rings etched into the clay, and tools twisted into strange shapes, although no one had been there. An independent photographer who took pictures of the location reported that when the negatives were developed, they showed the faint outlines of human figures. Hollow Creek is only marginal to the larger cultural perception. It is disregarded in documentaries, hardly ever discussed in museums, and not included on plantation tourism routes. However, the symbols associated with its legend can be found elsewhere, such as carved into the walls of Mississippi ruins, concealed panels on Georgian slave cabins that have been preserved, and even drawn in chalk during coastal South Carolinas. Gallagher funerals. Memory, not location, is what unites them. A memory that will not go away. According to some, The fabric between worlds was broken at Hollow Creek, where centuries of suffering reached a critical mass and caused a spiritual rupture. Others contend that it was a coded rebellion carried out by secret spiritual leaders, who employed long-standing African customs that were concealed from view. However, some murmur that it was a harvest of blood, debt, and reckoning, rather than either of those things. A documentary in 2021. A videographer made an effort to document the mythology of Hollow Creek. Inexplicably, the project was abandoned midway through production. Hard disks were corrupted, and footage was lost. The director released a single, still image but rejected interviews. An aerial photograph of the location captured by a drone. Like the spokes of a wheel or the fingers of a hand, the foliage in the picture seems to form 5 different lines that radiate outward from a central, blackened patch. Since the 19th century, the area has been abandoned. However, there are occasionally reports of odd lights there that flicker like lanterns in a fog and are blue and gold. When approached, they vanish, dogs reluctant to enter the treine. And on October 12th, without fail, the crickets fell silent, as if the soil is listening. The story of Hollow Creek is not a ghost story. Ghosts mean the dead are gone, remnants of a past that has been settled. The inhabitants are older, more ravenous, and something that burrows and deepens rather than fading with time. Certain harvests do not finish with the season. Some reapings never go away, and some names are still uttered, not out loud, but under one's breath in ritual out of terror because some cotton still bleeds.